I stood frozen, watching in horror as my beloved Victorian home was swallowed by flames, turning a century of history into ashes. Across the street, my HOA neighbor, Karen Whitmore, sipped her overpriced coffee, a smug smile curling on her lips as she whispered to her little circle of HOA board members. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally forced me out. What she didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, because I'm not just any homeowner. I'm a federal judge, and I have the power to dismantle everything she built. That morning started like any other. I sat on my grandmother's century-old porch swing, the wood creaking softly beneath me as I sipped my coffee. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over the purple trim that had made my Victorian home a landmark in the neighborhood. Then I saw her. Karen power-walking up the sidewalk in her designer sneakers, clutching a thick envelope like it was the Holy Grail. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, her HOA badge gleaming on her jacket. I had seen that determined look before, during every HOA meeting she hosted in her newly renovated McMansion next door. She dropped the envelope into my mailbox and lingered, pulling out her phone to snap pictures of my front yard. I knew exactly what she was doing, building a case against me. My grandmother's heritage rose garden stood in full bloom, their wild beauty a sharp contrast to Karen's perfectly trimmed boxwood hedges. She hated those roses. She hated anything she couldn't control. When I finally opened the envelope, I had to steady my hands. It was a formal invitation to join their newly formed HOA, complete with a glossy brochure featuring rows of identical beige houses with matching mailboxes. The membership fee? $5,000 up front, plus $350 a month. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. Attached to the invitation was a mandatory property modification list. Repaint my house to an HOA-approved neutral color, meaning my grandmother's beloved purple trim had to go. Remove my rose garden and replace it with approved vegetation. Take down the antique wind chimes that had lulled me to sleep since childhood. It was an attack on everything my home represented. I glanced outside just in time to see Karen walking back to her house, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried across the street, dripping with fake sweetness. Yes, I just delivered the final invitation. She has to join now. Her house is the last holdout on the street. My grip tightened on the paper. She wasn't just inviting me. She was demanding I fall in line. That evening, I walked up to Karen's front door, the HOA invitation in hand. Her doorbell chimed a painfully ironic tune. "We are the champions." Of course it did. She answered wearing a neighborhood watch captain badge, her lips stretched into what she probably thought was a welcoming smile. "I've reviewed your invitation," I said, keeping my voice calm. Years in the courtroom had taught me how to control my tone. "I need to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to preserve its historic character." Her smile vanished so fast you'd think I had insulted her entire existence. "You don't understand," she hissed, stepping closer. "This isn't really an invitation. The HOA has already been registered. Your property is surrounded by HOA members. You have to join." I pulled out the property maps I had researched that afternoon. "Actually, that's incorrect," I said coolly. "My deed predates any HOA agreements, and I have no legal obligation to join." Karen's face turned red. She leaned in, dropping the fake niceness. "Listen here," she whispered, her voice low and sharp. "This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult." I met her gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Whitmore?" She stepped back, her sugary smile returning. "Of course not," she laughed. "I'm just concerned about your property values and safety, that's all. Old houses like yours can be so unpredictable. Electrical problems, structural issues. It would be terrible if something happened." Something about the way her husband watched from the window, phone in hand, made my stomach tighten. Karen wasn't just trying to pressure me. She was warning me. That night, as I installed security cameras around my property, I felt the weight of something bigger brewing. Karen had declared war, and she had no idea who she was up against. I barely slept that night. Karen's warning echoed in my mind, her voice dripping with faux concern. It would be terrible if something happened. Behind her, her husband Robert had stood in the window, phone in hand, watching me like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. As I walked home, I could feel eyes on me, curtains shifting, silhouettes in windows. Karen's HOA allies were watching, waiting to see if I'd fold. I didn't. Instead, I spent the night installing security cameras around my property, making sure to capture every inch of my home, my fence, my heritage, rose garden, the very things Karen wanted gone. I had spent 20 years in law learning one unshakable truth: document everything. What I didn't know then was that this battle wasn't just about property values. It wasn't even about my grandmother's purple trim. Karen wanted me gone. The next morning, her voice shattered the quiet air outside my window. "Look at that hideous purple trim. It's ruining our property values." I pulled back my curtains and saw her standing on my lawn, surrounded by a small army of HOA members. They held clipboards, cameras, and measuring tape, inspecting my home like it was some kind of crime scene. Karen pointed dramatically at my front porch. And those ancient wind chimes, completely unapproved by HOA regulations. And the roses, at least 3 inches taller than regulation height. The group murmured in agreement, nodding like puppets. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, keeping my expression neutral. "Karen, you and your friends are trespassing." She just smiled. "We're simply conducting a routine neighborhood compliance check. After all, the HOA is responsible for maintaining high standards." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm not part of your HOA, remember?" Her smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes darkened. "Not yet." That was just the beginning. Over the next week, bright orange violation notices were plastered to my door every single day. According to Karen's fabricated rules, my house was suddenly a nuisance. First, they reported my garden, then the color of my house. Next, they went after my grass. One morning, I caught Karen and Linda Parker in my front yard. Linda had a ruler in hand, measuring my lawn. 11.5 inches, she announced triumphantly. Karen clapped her hands. "That's 3.5 inches over code. We'll have to file an official complaint." I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice calm. "You're on private property. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." Karen smirked, snapping another picture. "We're just ensuring neighborhood compliance." The harassment escalated. Landscapers started showing up at 7 a.m., sharp every Saturday, their equipment roaring to life directly outside my bedroom window. Anonymous complaints to the city became a weekly occurrence. Every time code enforcement officers showed up, I calmly provided legal documents proving my home's historic status, all while watching Karen fume from her window. But when psychological warfare didn't work, she got creative. One afternoon, as I sat in my home office, I heard loud voices outside. I looked out the window to find Karen had organized an HOA meeting directly in her driveway, facing my house. "Some people," she said loudly, "just don't understand that a community must have rules. Some houses, no matter how old, can bring down an entire neighborhood." HOA members nodded in agreement, casting quick glances toward my house. I clenched my jaw. Karen wasn't just pushing me. She was turning the entire neighborhood against me. Then came the final straw. Late one evening, as I reviewed security footage, something made my stomach turn. Karen's golden doodle had been using my lawn as his personal bathroom all week. I had proof, clear, high-resolution footage. The next morning, I confronted her. "Karen, your dog has been making a mess on my lawn. I have it all on camera." Karen gasped dramatically, clutching her pearls. "Oh, my dear, Bentley would never. You must be mistaken." Then she smirked. That was when I knew. She was just getting started. The breaking point came during the annual Ridgeview Estates block party, an event where the entire neighborhood gathered to celebrate. Except for me, of course. My invitation had conveniently gotten lost in the mail, but that didn't matter. I didn't need to be there to hear what was being said. Sitting on my porch, I sipped my coffee, letting the cool night air calm my nerves as Karen's shrill voice carried across the street. "Some of these older properties just don't fit the community vision anymore," she declared, not even trying to be subtle. I didn't need to look to know she was talking about my house. Then I saw them, a group of HOA members snapping pictures of my foundation, whispering among themselves. My fingers tightened around my mug. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were laying the groundwork for something bigger. I forced myself to stay calm. Instead of reacting, I documented everything. Every letter, Every complaint, every staged violation. They wanted a war, but I wasn't about to fight it on their terms. Days later, a new tactic emerged. Bright security floodlights suddenly appeared, installed on Karen's property but aimed directly at my bedroom windows. The blinding white light poured into my house, keeping me awake at all hours. I added light pollution harassment to my growing file. That night, I reviewed my security footage and saw something even more disturbing. Two HOA board members were inspecting my property line markers, whispering about easement regulations. I recognized that look. They were planning something bigger, and soon. I just didn't know how far they were willing to go. It was just past midnight when I woke up, feeling the nagging thirst that comes from hours of restless sleep. As I made my way to the kitchen, I caught movement outside. Frowning, I glanced out the window, then froze. Karen and two HOA board members were skulking around my property. In their hands, chemical sprayers. My stomach turned cold. They were targeting my grandmother's century-old rose garden. I grabbed my phone and hit record as I stepped onto the porch. "What do you think you're doing?" My voice was calm but sharp. Karen jumped but recovered quickly, her fake smile spreading like poison. "Oh, we're just helping eliminate these invasive species," she said sweetly, continuing to spray the bushes. "The HOA has strict rules, you know. If you just joined us, we could have handled this properly." I stepped closer, my blood boiling, but my voice steady. "Those aren't invasive species, Karen. They're heritage Victorian roses planted by my grandmother in 1960. I have the original documentation and Gardening Society registration to prove it." The two board members shifted uncomfortably. But Karen, she didn't back down. She sniffed dramatically, adjusting her designer pajamas. "Well, someone complained about the smell, and these thorns, such a safety hazard for children walking by." I flicked on my security lights. Bright white beams flooded the yard. "On my private property? Behind my fence?" I challenged. Karen hesitated, but before she could respond, her husband Robert emerged from the shadows. The former police sergeant thought his presence alone would intimidate me. Now, he said smoothly, arms crossed. "No need to throw around accusations. We're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. Nobody wants to live next to a jungle." I clenched my jaw. Across the street, I noticed Mrs. Collins, an elderly neighbor who had been bullied into joining the HOA. She peeked through her curtains, fear in her eyes. Just last month, her beautiful rock garden had been ripped out and replaced with generic HOA-approved shrubs. I knew what they were doing, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. Karen never wasted an opportunity to humiliate me. That evening, she paraded potential buyers past my property, her voice loud enough for me to hear from my front porch. "Of course, this eyesore will be dealt with soon," she announced, flashing her practiced smile at the small group of house hunters. "We have ways of handling difficult residents." I clenched my jaw but stayed put. I wasn't giving her the reaction she wanted. The next week, the harassment intensified. First, my mailbox was knocked over 3 times. I put it back up each time, but by morning, it would be on the ground again. Then came the anonymous complaints. According to HOA reports, I was hosting loud parties late at night. That would have been impressive, considering I wasn't even home when the alleged disturbances occurred. Code enforcement officers began showing up daily, citing concerns about property safety, despite finding nothing wrong. Each time, Karen would be conveniently watching from her window, arms crossed, lips curled in satisfaction. Even my garbage bins vanished, only to be discovered out of compliance with HOA rules. I documented everything. The photographs, reports, security footage, all neatly organized. I was building my case quietly, but Karen's group was growing bolder. They started hosting HOA meetings in front of my house, pointing out violations to potential new residents. "This property is dragging down our home values," Karen declared, waving her designer handbag for emphasis. "But don't worry, it won't be a problem much longer." That was the final straw. One night, I caught Karen and her cronies tampering with my historic fence. They pretended to measure the sidewalk, but my security cameras told a different story. Karen leaned in, whispering to one of the board members. "Once these posts fail inspection, she'll have to replace the whole fence with our approved model," she said, smirking. "That'll cost her thousands, unless she joins the HOA, of course." I sat back, reviewing the footage, my mind racing. Then I noticed something else. something far worse. HOA inspection teams were consistently taking photos of my home's utilities, electrical boxes, gas lines, water connections. They weren't just harassing me. They were documenting every vulnerability my house had. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to act fast, but I couldn't tip my hand too soon. I held my coffee cup tightly as I scanned the morning paper, my eyes skimming over the headline about a major corruption case, one that I had just sentenced. Then the courtroom doors burst open. My clerk, Sophia Harris, stood there, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Your house, it's on fire." The words slammed into my chest like a sledgehammer. I didn't hesitate. I ripped off my judge's robe, bolted down the courthouse steps, and jumped into my car. 15 minutes. That's all it took to drive home, but it felt like a lifetime. 3 blocks away, I saw black smoke curling into the sky. My stomach turned to ice. I floored the gas pedal, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. By the time I arrived, my beloved Victorian home, the one that had been in my family for 3 generations, was an inferno. The purple trim my grandmother had lovingly painted was consumed by raging orange flames. The roof had collapsed in places, embers floating like fireflies against the night sky. The ancient wooden beams groaned under the weight of the fire's relentless assault. Everything, every memory, every piece of my family's history was disappearing before my eyes. Tears burned behind my eyelids, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, my gaze locked onto Karen. She stood in her driveway, her designer yoga pants pristine, her overpriced coffee steaming in her hand. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't shocked. She was watching, chatting casually with HOA board members as my home burned. They weren't even trying to hide their satisfaction. Whispers, pointing, smug smiles. The fire chief, Daniel Roberts, approached me, his face grim. "Ma'am, it looks like an electrical fire. These old houses, the wiring can be dangerous." But I knew better. Just yesterday, I had my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code, just like always. I had made sure of it, especially after Karen's repeated warnings about my house being unsafe. Then I remembered. The security cameras. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, trying to access the footage. The screen was blank. My cameras had stopped recording at exactly 3:00 a.m., 4 hours before the fire started. That was no coincidence. The flames had died down, but the smell of smoke and charred wood lingered in the air. My once beautiful Victorian home was now a hollow shell, its century-old history reduced to ashes. As I stood there, my hands trembling, memories flashed through my mind. Baking cookies with Grandma in that kitchen, celebrating my law school graduation in the garden, the morning I put on my judicial robe for the first time. All of it, gone because I refused to bow to Karen Whitmore and her corrupt HOA. I gritted my teeth and pulled out my phone, my security cameras. With shaking fingers, I tried to access the footage, praying for answers. The screen was blank. The cameras had stopped recording at exactly 3:00 a.m., 4 hours before the fire started. That was no accident. My stomach twisted, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just an act of arson. It was a coordinated attack. I scanned the crowd of neighbors, my eyes landing on 2 familiar faces, David Simmons and Jason Brooks, both HOA board members. They were trying to blend in, but their work boots caught my attention. The same boots I had seen on my security footage last week when my rose bushes were vandalized. Now those boots were covered in something. Mud? Or was it ash? Then Karen appeared, strutting across her driveway with a practiced look of concern. "Oh, this is just terrible," she sighed, shaking her head in mock sympathy. Her designer coffee mug was still steaming, and she took a slow sip, watching my destroyed home like she was enjoying a morning talk show. "If only you had joined the HOA. We have such strict safety requirements. But you were so stubborn about keeping things historic." She emphasized that last word like it was dirty. I bit down so hard on my tongue I tasted blood. Not yet. I couldn't show my hand. Instead, I watched as Karen casually pulled out her phone, quickly typing something. Moments later, I overheard a nearby conversation. "Did you hear? That lot just went on the market. Some exclusive real estate group is making an offer already." I turned sharply, my fists clenching. That was their plan all along. Burn me out, buy me out, not happening. The fire department finally got the blaze under control, but it was too late. The stained glass windows, the intricate porch railings, the handcrafted woodwork, all of it was destroyed. As I stood in the morning light watching the last tendrils of smoke curl into the sky, I made a decision. Karen thought she had won. She thought she had broken me, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. One to my friend at the FBI, one to my contact at the state attorney's office, and one to a private investigator I trusted. Across the street, I caught Karen watching me. For the first time, I saw hesitation flash across her face. She didn't know who I was calling, but something in my posture, my unwavering stance, must have sent a chill down her spine. Good. Let her worry, because while my house lay in ruins, my real power had nothing to do with property. It had everything to do with justice. Karen's smug victory didn't last long. While she paraded around the neighborhood, spreading rumors that I had burned my own house for insurance money, I was quietly pulling at the threads of her empire, and the first breakthrough came faster than I expected. My old law school friend, now a real estate investigator, called me after a deep dive into recent property transactions. Evelyn, you're going to want to see this. Every single house that had mysteriously burned down in our county over the past 5 years had been sold to the same shell company. The owner? Karen's sister-in-law. My hands shook as I flipped through the property records. It was too perfect to be a coincidence, too calculated. I hired a private investigator who started tracking down former homeowners who had been forced out. Their stories matched mine exactly. Harassment, fake violations, threats. And when they refused to sell or join the HOA, mysterious accidents, fires. One elderly man broke down in tears telling my investigator how he lost a lifetime of family photos in a suspicious garage fire, the day after refusing to sign HOA documents. This wasn't just corruption. This was organized crime, and Karen was at the center of it. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Every former neighbor I contacted had the same story: join the HOA or suffer. The harassment followed a predictable pattern: HOA violation letters, code enforcement citations, anonymous complaints. And if that didn't work, accidents, fires. Most had given up, forced to sell their homes for pennies on the dollar, always to the same real estate group, which conveniently flipped the properties into HOA-controlled developments. One elderly man, Mr. Hendricks, broke down in tears as he recounted the night he lost everything. "I refused to sign their papers," he whispered, voice shaking. "The next morning, my garage was on fire. My wife's wedding album, my father's military medals, all gone. The fire chief called it an accident, but I knew better." It was the same story over and over. Karen's HOA wasn't about community standards. It was a criminal operation. The breakthrough came from a source I never expected. Karen's former assistant treasurer, a woman named Elena Morales, reached out to my lawyer. She agreed to meet in secret, choosing a quiet diner 2 towns over. She arrived looking nervous, glancing over her shoulder before sliding into the booth across from me. Her hands trembled as she pulled a USB drive from her purse. This has everything," she whispered. 5 years of HOA financial records." I didn't even touch my coffee. "Why are you coming forward now?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "Karen forced me to cook the books," she admitted. "She found out I was undocumented and threatened to report me if I didn't do what she asked." Her voice cracked. "I can't live with it anymore. That money, it wasn't just HOA fees. After every fire, there were cash deposits, hundreds of thousands." I gripped the USB drive tightly. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized fraud, extortion, and arson on a massive scale. I spent sleepless nights piecing together the evidence. Karen's husband, Robert Whitmore, hadn't just retired from the police force. He had been a fire investigator, and every suspicious fire in the area over the past 5 years had been quickly ruled an accident. No further questions asked. Insurance companies had paid out millions, all based on his reports. But that wasn't all. My security cameras had captured more than just the arsonists. There were weekly meetings at Karen's house, not just HOA gatherings, but private sessions with real estate developers. The recordings told a damning story. Developers, salivating over prime land, openly discussed bribing city officials to change zoning laws once enough properties were under HOA control. One even bragged on camera, "Once we push her out, the final piece falls into place. That shopping complex will print money." That's when I realized Karen hadn't targeted me out of personal spite. She had inside information. I spent days digging through county records, searching for answers. And then I found it, an old city planning map. Right there, marked in bold red ink, was a planned highway expansion. Karen's developer friends had been tipped off. My property was the linchpin to their entire multi-million-dollar project. They had already acquired the surrounding land through shell companies. But my house, it was the last piece of the puzzle. Without it, their entire plan would collapse. That's why Karen had been so relentless. That's why she burned my house to the ground. She hadn't just been running an extortion racket. She was at the center of a massive real estate conspiracy. I took my findings to the FBI. I convinced them to wire up Elena Morales for one final meeting with Karen. What we captured was worse than I ever imagined. Karen laughing, openly discussing who their next target would be. "That old man on Ridgeway Drive," she sneered. "His house has electrical issues. Could go up any day now." And then the final nail in her coffin. "Elena, if you ever breathe a word of this, I'll make sure you disappear." The recording was airtight. Karen had just incriminated herself. Meanwhile, Karen's desperation was showing. She filed daily complaints about my property, now just a burned-out shell. She even had the nerve to propose a special HOA assessment fee, forcing neighbors to pay for the cleanup of my lot. Her goal? To make my land worthless, to force me out. But she had no idea I already had everything I needed to take her down. Karen had no idea what was coming. For 6 months, I had painstakingly built my case, gathering evidence, securing witnesses, and working with the FBI to bring down her corrupt empire. Now, as I stood outside the community center, my heart pounded in my chest. Inside, Karen strutted through the entrance, coffee mug in one hand and HOA documents in the other, completely unaware that this meeting would be her last. Through the window, I could see her setting up her PowerPoint presentation, no doubt filled with fake violations and fabricated rules. I touched my judicial robes neatly folded inside my briefcase. The FBI wire under my blazer was a weight I welcomed. Everything had to be perfect. "The property at 247 Maple Street has been declared a public nuisance." Karen's voice rang out through the room. I pushed the door open quietly, stepping inside. "As per our emergency powers, we'll be moving forward with immediate redevelopment plans." A murmur swept through the crowd. My neighbors shifted uncomfortably, many too afraid to speak up. Karen scanned the room, smirking. "Any objections?" she asked, her beady eyes daring anyone to challenge her. I stepped forward. "I object, Mrs. Whitmore." The room went silent. Karen's head snapped toward me, her smirk faltering for just a second. Then she recovered. "Well, well," she sneered. "Come to finally admit defeat? Your burned-out wreck of a house is quite the eyesore. We're actually doing you a favor." She took a slow sip of coffee, wearing that same smug smile she had the morning my house burned. I unclasped my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, dropping it onto the table. "Actually, I'm here to present evidence of my own." I spread photographs across the table, security footage, emails, financial records. "These cameras show you and your board members trespassing on my property the night of the fire. Interesting timing, don't you think?" Karen's face twitched. "That could be anyone," she said quickly. "And you can't prove." "Oh, but I can." I flipped through more pages, pulling out bank records. "Mysterious payments to your shell company after every distressed property sale. Emails detailing your plans to force out non-HOA members. And my personal favorite, your text messages about making sure the electrical fire looked accidental." Gasps erupted around the room. Karen's hands trembled, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You can't just come in here with wild accusations. I'll sue you for defamation." That was my cue. I reached into my briefcase one last time. With a slow, deliberate motion, I slipped on my judicial robes. "Federal Judge Evelyn Carter," I announced, watching the blood drain from Karen's face. "Currently presiding over case number 2025 CR 142, United States versus Whitmore et al., a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Karen's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Hot liquid splashed over her designer shoes, but she didn't even notice. Her mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Then, FBI, nobody move! Right on cue, agents stormed the room. Karen's husband, Robert Whitmore, made a desperate dash for the exit. He didn't make it 3 steps before being tackled to the ground. I turned to Karen, who had collapsed into her chair, her face pale as a ghost. You know what the biggest mistake criminals make? I asked calmly. They get so caught up in their own power, they forget to check who they're really dealing with. The courtroom was silent as I read the verdict. Karen Whitmore, you have been found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, arson, and racketeering. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Her face turned ashen, her hands trembling. Her HOA board members received 15 years each, their roles in the scheme undeniable. For the first time, Karen understood. No amount of money, no real estate connections, no HOA bylaws could save her now. She tried to protest, but I cut her off, just as she had silenced my pleas for my grandmother's roses. The gavel slammed down. Court adjourned. That was 6 months ago. Now I stand in front of my newly rebuilt Victorian home, watching construction workers put the finishing touches on the porch. The purple trim is exactly as my grandmother had painted it. The rose garden is coming back, regrown from cuttings of the only bush that survived. Across the street, Karen's former house has new owners. A kind immigrant family moved in, their children laughing as they play in the yard where Karen once measured my grass with a ruler. There is no more HOA. Instead, my neighbors formed a real community association, one that helps instead of harasses. Block parties are held in my garden now. Just last night, Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas, while the Patel family shared stories of their late grandfather, the same man whose ashes were nearly lost to Karen's greed. As I sip my morning coffee, I run my fingers over Karen's old coffee mug, the one she dropped in shock the night of her arrest. It sits on my courthouse desk now, a reminder that justice may take time, but it never fails. And every morning as I watch the sunrise through my perfectly purple-trimmed windows, I know that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about rebuilding something more beautiful than what they tried to take away. At its core, this story is about justice, resilience, and the power of standing up to corruption, no matter how powerful the opposition may seem. It highlights how unchecked authority, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a tool for greed and destruction. Karen and her HOA weren't just enforcing neighborhood rules. They were running an organized scheme to intimidate, steal, and profit at the expense of others. Yet, like many who abuse power, they made the mistake of underestimating the wrong person. The lesson here is clear. Truth, patience, and perseverance will always prevail over corruption. It would have been easier for the protagonist to sell the house, to walk away from the harassment, or to bend to the pressure. But she refused to let injustice win. Instead, she meticulously built her case, exposing the truth and ensuring that Karen and her accomplices face the consequences of their actions. This reminds us that justice may take time, but it never fails when pursued with determination. The story also teaches us that a community should be built on support, not control. The contrast between the oppressive HOA and the real community that formed afterward proves that true neighborhoods thrive when people look out for one another, not when they enforce arbitrary rules for personal gain. In the end, the protagonist didn't just reclaim her home, she helped create something better. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destruction. It's about rebuilding something stronger, more beautiful, and more just. This story is a reminder that when we stand against corruption, we don't just protect ourselves, we protect everyone who comes after us.